So welcome everybody to this, the second of our monthly webinar series for 2022. And of course, it's hosted by ODLAA, which is the Open and Distance Learning Association of Australia. And as it says on the slide there, it's an international professional association for a range of people interested and enthusiastic and dedicated to the advancement of research practice and support of education that happens across time and space. One of the really good attractions of ODLAA is its journal called Distance Education. And as a member of ODLAA, actually, you get direct access to that journal. Many of the topics of our webinar series this year will be presented by authors who have been published in the journal recently. And that is exactly the case for today's webinar. I'd like to introduce you to the authors of a really interesting article that was published last November in the November 2021 issue of Distance Learning. So welcome Hung Tang from the University of South Carolina in Columbia, and Yu Bao from James Madison University in Virginia. Their article is called Latent Class Analysis of K-12 Teachers' Barriers to Implementing Open Education Resources. So open education, including the use of open education resources, is dear to the hearts of many around the world. And indeed, there is the word open in the name of this organization, ODLAA. In fact, the first week in March this year, there was a whole week dedicated to the active sharing and learning about the latest achievements in open education worldwide. And that event was organized by Open Education Global. And I'll just pop the link to their website, which just, if you want to follow up with that at any time, you get to see a range of the events that were run earlier this month. And they have been marking open education for about 10 years now. So it's not a new thing. But the aspirations behind open education and the use of OER may be very noble and well supported by many, many people. The actual implementation of practices is not so straightforward. There are many obstacles related to perceptions, to skill, to knowledge, and of course, many challenges at the operational level. So Hung Tao and Yu report on their investigation into barriers that K-12 teachers perceive that they encounter when it comes to implementing OERs. So I will now pass over to Hung Tao and to Yu to lead us through their presentation. Please feel free to pop questions or comments in the chat, but Hung Tao and Yu will sort of drive things and we'll take their lead. But I'll make sure that we don't forget if a question comes up in the chat and make sure we address it. So over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. First, thank you for your welcome notes, and I really appreciate your kind of like great summary of our article, and also, making the comments, making the remarks on the OER. And also, thank you, Dr. Naidu, and also thank you, Antonina, for your great work in editing this article. Really appreciate that. And also, thank you everyone who make the time to attend our webinar. So let's get started. I cannot wait for that. As Sarah introduced, so our title for this webinar is Latent Class Analysis of K-12 Teachers' Barriers to Implementing OER. So just to do a very brief introduction of myself and also my co-authors, Dr. Yu Bao from James Madison University. She's also here with us. And my name is Hung Tang, Assistant Professor from the University of South Carolina. So we have been very familiar with, textbooks, right? So that's kind of like the primary channel for us to exchange knowledge or kind of like deliver knowledge from the teachers to students. But sometimes textbooks cannot satisfy all of our needs for all of the educators. Sometimes the textbooks may fail to provide exactly what educators need. And sometimes it is so expensive for everyone, for each student to purchase them. And the content kind of like updating very quickly. Textbook publishers may not be able to rapidly respond to the change in the course standards. That kind of results in a mismatch between the content and also course standards. Teachers, most of the time, they need to teach outside the textbooks to support the personalized instruction to help everyone achieve their own goals. But high subscription fees and also the copyright restrictions constrain teachers' capacity in customizing many of the resources to meet the students' needs. So with that being said, we have the OER, right? So educators start to implement OER in K-12 settings as a way to offset the increasing cost and support the personalized learning. Here is the definition of the OER from the early version of the UNESCO when it was considered in 2002. OER, the teaching, learning, and research materials in any medium, digital or otherwise, that resident in the public domain or have been released under an open license that permits no-cost access, use, adaptation, and redistribution by others with no or limited restrictions. So there are two inherent benefits associated with OER. One definitely is the free access, right? It can significantly lower the educational cost. The other part was about the open licenses. So for the open licenses, we can as educators, we can manipulate the resources for repurposing to satisfy individual needs. Actually, that's just like, two apparent feature inherent in OER. With the open licenses, we can do even more than that. So we have the 5R principles, right? So we have the return, reuse, revise, remix, redistribute. For the return, we can keep a copy, we can download. For the reuse, we can just download it and then reuse it without any changes. For revise and remix, those are the two most powerful ways for using the open license resources because we can personalize it, right? So we never need it. We can make the changes, we can make the revisions for our own purpose. And the redistribution, after we create something, after we adapt something, we can share it, just for our targeted audiences. So that's kind of like a further, increase the benefits of the OER. So OER has been becoming very popular in the K-12 education. But there are some concerns about like OER, some educators may think, since it's free, students may not just work hard enough to perform as well as the courses using the traditional textbooks. But the research has shown that OER has no harm to student achievement and also learner motivation in the K-12 education settings. And also Dr. Royce Kimmins also did a study when he tried to compare, ask the educators to compare different types of the textbooks, including the open textbooks, kind of like directly from the OpenStax. That's kind of like an open textbook. And also the other one is the adapted one. So they can have the freedom to make the adaptation based on the open textbooks. The third group is the traditional textbooks. When those 30 educators were asked to compare those, their perceptions, their experience with using different types of the textbooks, they prefer the customized open textbooks by teachers, that is adapted textbooks the most, followed by the open, directly open textbooks directly available from the open text. So from there, we can see, OER is very promising in K-12 education. It doesn't harm to student achievement, and teachers also prefer to using it, not only because of free access or low cost. And also, this is a national initiative, very popular in the United States. It's called Go Open. From this map, you can see it kind of like be very popular in different states, almost every state, in the East Coast and also some in the Western Coast. So with those kind of like national initiatives, OER has been increasingly popular in the K-12 education. However, here it comes, the barriers. For teachers, when teachers using the OER, there are still a lot of barriers. So we probably have been very familiar with the barriers about the technology integration that is proposed by Dr. Peggy Ertmer. the first order and the second order barriers. But beyond that, kind of like the dichotomy of the barriers in technology integration, Dr. Royce Kimmons also discussed 3 levels of the teachers' perceived barriers about using OER, including macro, local, and personal barriers. So I will overview those 3 types of the barriers in the next several slides. So the first one about like the macro barrier and the local barrier, it's kind of like equal to the the first order barrier. It addresses the external ones. Although all of the 3-level barriers are kind of like challenging, but Kimmons found that the macro level and also local barriers were more challenging than personal level barriers for teachers. So macro level barriers are teachers' barriers that exceed the reach of local school district, but require outside help from states, publishers, and other entities to overcome those barriers. For example, a lack of legislative support or a lack of a proper OER that can address the course criteria or address their personal needs. The next level is about the local barriers, are those that require support from schools, school districts to overcome. For example, like a lack of time to try using the OER, a lack of the technology infrastructures, a lack of opportunities for professional development, or a lack of the community acknowledgement. These kind of like the local barriers that can be addressed by the school district. So one of my previous research found out some first order barriers, like a lack of supportive climate in the school, or a lack of sufficient time or support that throughout their use of the OERs in the K-12 settings. Also, in different cultural contexts, teachers from relatively underdeveloped areas may not have enough money or time to consume or produce OER, just due to limited budget for the necessary infrastructure. So this is kind of like a result from the local barrier, the school district level. The third level, for sure, personal barriers, similar to the second order barriers of the technology integration, include those that can be solved by teachers themselves, such as their beliefs, value beliefs, expertise about using OER. For example, their lack of the adequate technology skills, willingness, or pedagogical knowledge to integrate OER efficiently will affect their use as well. So we have described those 3 levels of the barriers for the use of OER in K-12 settings. So here is our rationale to conduct this research. We want to help teachers overcome these barriers. The most efficient way, as OER is try to provide the personalized instruction. So we understand that the most efficient way is to provide the personalized support for teachers to overcome these barriers. But for now, many studies applied a descriptive approach using interviews or surveys that just focus on what the barriers are. So like, describe what are the 3 levels of barriers or what kind of like challenges, constraints teachers' use of knowledge. Evidence about the individual difference in how teachers' barrier influences their use of OER still unknown. So our study is trying to close this gap in the current literature. Research purpose, we aim to conduct a person-centered analysis of K-12 teachers' barriers in implementing OER. So we try to address 3 levels, like methodologically, we want to address the limitation by a descriptive approach. Intellectual merit, we try to tap into the profile-specific patterns and then identify what kind of predictors of teachers' barriers in using OER and how teachers' barriers affect their perception of using OER. Practically, by understand the person-centered and understand the person-centered features, we try to identify professional development strategies or provide tailored support for teachers. Here are 2 research questions for this study. What are teachers' profiles in regard to their barriers in implementing OER? And the second one, how does teachers' perception of OER differ by their profiles? We use the open data set collected by the OER Research Hub in the Open University in the United States. They kindly released the data set with the Creative Commons license so that we can use it. So yeah, kudos to the research group here. Their survey assessed the respondents' perception of how OER influenced teaching and learning. And they received 6,390 people, the responses from 180 different countries. So for the participants for this study, they have a large population, but for this study, we only focused on the K-12 teachers. There were about 675 K-12 teachers. But within those K-12 teachers, we only focused on who answered the questions about the challenges, or we call it barriers. At the end, we have 367 participants, including 125 female teachers and 130 male teachers who indicated their genders. Participants come from like 72 countries, 82 of them were native English speakers. And a total of 202 participants had taught for at least 3 years in K-12 schools. We try to identify the different variables. So for the teachers' barriers in using OER, we coded the question about which challenges, if any, do you most often face in using OERs. This item consists of 17, this question consists of 17 items. So the participants just respond to yes or no to indicate like whether they have suffered from this barrier. We removed 2 questions because one of them is kind of like, others, please specify. So this type of question was removed. And the other one was asking like the challenge of not having connections with the OER using peers. So we try to code it following the categories of the teacher's barriers, but we found that it is a little bit irrelevant or misaligned with this framework. So we also removed this one. And then finally, we recorded 15 items, and for each category or each level of the barriers, we recorded 5. So here is can you see the picture clearly? Yeah, here is the 3 level of the barriers, and also its subcategories, and then kind of like 5 items for each level of the barriers. Then we try to identify some digital outcomes about their perceptions, the teacher's perceptions of the effectiveness of using OER. So we have like 8 digital outcomes, digital outcome variables. 2 of them are yes or no questions, and the other 6 focus on using the Likert type scale. Most of them are 5 Likert type scale, and the last one using 3-point level. For the analysis part, we use the latent class analysis. We try to identify like the group of the discrete latent variable models for multivariate categorical data. For this study, we use the 3-step approach of the latent class analysis with the digital outcome included in the analysis. So each discrete value for the latent variable represents a latent class characterized by a pattern of conditional probabilities of teachers' barriers of using OER. For the latent class, the first step is definitely to determine the optimum number of the latent classes. So we did we checked the 2 conditions, like the latent class models with the class number ranging from 2 to 5. The other option was the restricted latent class model with 8 fixed latent classes. We try to calculate the ASE, BSE, and also the SE, BSE model, the coefficients to determine the better fitted model. Here's the result from our calculation. You can see like the values varied a lot across the different options and also different coefficients. And based on the literature, the BSE model is the preferable index when we're choosing the latent class. If they're kind of like conflict across all the values, all the kind of like options. So based on this literature support, we choose 3 as our optimal class numbers. So which means like we will identify 3 classes from our analysis. The second step is to assign the participants in the latent classes. And the third step was to estimate the desired auxiliary model to analyze the digital outcomes. So here is another figure. Oh, sorry. Can you see that clearly? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for confirming. Yeah, so as I showed, like here, we have the first step, focus on the, determine the number of the classes, and then we try to assign them into the different classes. Then the next step is to focus on the digital outcome analysis. So here's the results from our analysis here. So you can see there are 3 different levels. I'm sorry, this figure included a kind of like a typical sample that I will showcase later. The blue one is an individual case, so you can overlook this one for this result here. But just focus on the red, green, and also black lines here. So for the class 1, here is a black one. We call it the savvy classes, the OER savvy or OER expert. This class had the lowest mean score of the likelihood for all of the barriers. You can see the level is really low. It's around like 0.2. This class has around like 197 the teachers. So over more than a half of the total population for this study. So this class of the teachers were likely not to have any of the barriers based on our analysis here. Then the second class focused on the red line here, or pink. I'm not sure which color it looks like on your screen, but you can see the difference, right? So this class has around like 36 students, just like almost 10% of the total, sample. This class was more likely to have all of the types of the barriers. So you can see the likelihood is very high compared to the other 2 classes. So this class recorded a much higher score in the probability to bump into the personal barriers. So for the personal barriers for other 2 classes, you can see it's not so high for the expert group or savvy group. It's around like 0.2. For the other group, it's around less than 0.4. But for this group, for the struggling class, it's as high as 0.8. So they are more likely to have the personal level barriers. And this class also had the highest likelihood of personal barriers among all of the 3 types of the OER barriers, sorry. The class 3, the green one, resource constrained class, that's the name we give it to this class, and you can see why. The likelihood to run into the macro barrier was pretty high. You can see here, right? So it's almost 0.7. But for the other 2 types of the barriers, the likelihood was relatively low. It's around like 0.3. Another interesting finding was like this class was right in the middle for across all the 3 levels of the barriers. But what is, it is noteworthy that the teachers in this class were more likely to be challenged by a lack of, the resources when implementing OER in the class. So although, I just want to note here, although we call it like a macro level barriers, I forgot to mention when I try to introduce the questions, we coded to the different level of the barriers. For the macro level barriers, most of the questions focused on the, the lack of resources. So we don't have any questions regarding like the legislative support, but we only focus on the lack of the resources. So here we think, this class is more likely to be challenged by a lack of resources here. And we also did some, personalized analysis. We try to figure out the diagnose report. So here is why you can see the green, the blue line, the ID number 217. This is the individual case. So we did some the diagnosis report. We compare like this individual's responses to all of the questions, and we outlined the the levels here. For this individual's responsive to all the 3 levels here, and here is like where the value belongs to in the graph. And we also try to provide the classification probabilities for different classes, and then this person was assigned to the class 3. So here is the results from the the third step of our analysis, focused on the digital outcomes. So from the first question, we can see, the adaptation rate is pretty high. Most of the teachers adapt OER to fit their needs. rather than just, grabbing the OER off the shelf. But it's interesting, like, for the no barrier group, or we call it the savvy group or expert group, they had the lowest one, although all the three groups are high. And for the second list outcome questions, we can see, creating and publishing their own resources was not common, because this score compared to the last one is super low. It's around just like a 0.1, right? So means like those teachers who responded to this question, they just don't want to, have never created the resources by themselves and published it. Then for the by the way, the first question are the yes or no questions. So we got the number as a little bit lower than the other, the Likert type scale questions. And for the digital outcomes item 3 to the item 7, those are the 5-point Likert type scale questions. And then we found out like the resource constraint class, after using the OER, they are more likely to collaborate with colleagues. And they believe using OER can increase the learner's satisfaction, improve the student grades, accommodate the learner needs, and also increase the learner engagement. So we will discuss later in the discussion section or the conclusion section. I go back to writing the paper, right? So it's kind of like to write the discussion section. So yeah, I will discuss like what we found from these results. And also the last list outcomes, we found the teachers from the first class may have no change after using the OER regarding like whether they want to use the open educational resource repertory materials for their teaching. But the other two, those two classes were more likely to integrate OER repertory materials in their own class. So after showcasing our results, I just want to share like what we learned from the results. So first, our study is just like a very initial preliminary effort, try to investigate teachers' barriers in using OER from the person-centered perspective. Our study revealed 3 classes of teacher profiles based on their self-reported barriers in using OER: the savvy class, the struggling class, and also the resource constraint classes. And then we found there's a gap between teachers' increasing need for appropriate OER and the teacher's low intention of creating and sharing or publishing OER. So we will break down into each of them in the next slide. So for the first class, those teachers had low likelihood of suffering from those all 3 types of the barriers based on our results. And this amounted to almost more than a half of the total sample. So, but we don't think like this result can allow us to assume that those teachers effectively use OER in their teaching without any hurdles, right? So adaptation was one of the most efficient ways to use OER. But if you recall, when I tried to show the results, it is a little surprising to me. This class had the lowest likelihood of adapting OER, although it's all of the 3 classes had a pretty high value. For this cohort, for this class, professional support may focus on improving their awareness and also skill set of adapting OER, right? And also this class of teachers recorded no changes in their intentions to integrate the OER repertory materials in their future classes after using OER. So we speculated that, maybe they just return or reuse OER without or low adaptations. This kind of like a reuse or return may not allow them to experience all of the benefits, such as the openness inherent to OER. The second, the resource constraint class, sorry, actually it should be the third class. Teachers who had a much higher likelihood of encountering micro barriers, especially a lack of appropriate OER than other types of the barriers. So this class of teachers were most likely to adapt OER based on our findings. So our speculations is like this class of teachers made revisions or remixed OER just because they don't have enough resources, or they may have difficulties to find relevant OER stuff for their own needs. That kind of like driven them to that has driven them to do more revision or remix to adapt OER to satisfy their instruction needs. In addition, the resource constraint class also reported the highest appraisal of the impact of OER on teaching and learning. And they indicated they were more likely to integrate OER in their future teaching practices. So this result seemed promising, but after further think about that, we felt like external aids, external support are still needed, and this should come beyond the school district level. For example, we needed the support from the governments, we needed the support from the educational authorities, and also the publisher, right? So they needed to provide more, personalized support for the teachers from different areas, for them to find the relevant OERs, for them to adapt, and the modified OER for their personal needs. Then the struggling class. Teachers in this class had a much higher likelihood of bumping into all types of OER. But this class involved only a small percentage of the teachers in this study. We speculated, this survey is kind of like distributed to the teachers who have used the OER or kind of like early user OER. They may just be very optimistic about the user OER. That's kind of like probably one of the reasons why the struggling class just accounted for 10% of the population. I'm not pessimistic about that, but I just want to say this kind of like a limitation of the study. On the other hand, I really hope like most of the teachers, I really hope this can be the fact that like only 10% of the teachers who use the OER in K-12 settings had the barriers across all the three tabs, right? So that's kind of our hope. So this class had the lowest perceptions of the impact OER on teaching and learning. That's for sure, no doubt, and no surprising. But they reported that they would integrate OER in teaching practices. So this means like, the group who want to use OER suffered the barriers across all three types of the barriers, which means that, supporting this class of teachers is very critical to further the adoption of the OER in K-12 settings. So, but their challenges across three different levels, which means that we need to support, we need to involve different stakeholders to support them. From the macro level, like we may have more nationwide initiatives to have more local educational authorities, the school district to get on board with using OER. We may have more, pertinent to the professional development opportunities for those teachers oriented to using not only just a return or reuse, but kind of like adapting, creating, and also redistributing the OER. Those kind of like a professional development opportunities are needed. And again, we also found that there is a gap between teachers' increasing need for appropriate OER and teachers' low intention of creating and sharing OER. This, for us, this is a very serious concern. Like we can see more people want to use their OER, but the responses to that survey, the survey item regarding like have you ever created or published OER, the responses are very low. So we can see there's this, a gap about like how to fill the gap between the needs and also their low intention of creating and sharing OER. Teachers were still challenged by the lack of OER, which are relevant to some subject areas. They may don't have the high quality, or they may don't have the timeliness of the resources, or maybe some OER will not align with the local course standards and context. So one of the efficient way is to encourage more teachers to get involved in the practice of, not only using, but kind of like fulfill their agency in this initiative to try to create and also sharing their OER. So a viable option is to, to overcome this shortage is to involve teachers for sure, since, teachers know best about like what they need, right? So this is kind of like a viable option to overcome the shortage. But, as we mentioned, like this study just suggests only 10% of the teachers have created or shared their resources. So this gap reinforces the need to encourage the teachers to participate in creating and sharing OER. But to avoid, sometimes if we just encourage them to start to create or share OER, this may bring another concern regarding the quality, right? The effectiveness of those materials. So researchers have discussed another option, the open educational practices. So open educational practices includes a series of practices of finding, creating, adapting, integrating, and then redistributing OER. So different from other, just like the traditional PD, OEPs can help teachers give them a contextualized experience, give them the contextualized opportunity to learn about what is OER, to understand the potential of the OER, and also to create and republish their OERs in an authentic setting. So this is kind of like give them a chance to fully experience what is OER from the very beginning of like finding, searching to the very end, like creating and publishing. So open educational practice may be another option. We just hope like maybe we can conduct more research to see how we can better support teachers to overcome their barriers by providing them efficient the open educational practices. So for sure, for this study, we have some of the limitations. We try to use open data set, and we code the responsive to the items following the K-means or the framework. We try to following the framework, following the concept, the meanings, and also we do the validations across the authors. But the subjectivity is still kind of limited our findings. Another part, we use a list-wide deletion method when we try to manage missing data in the responses. So this also limits the findings of our study. And for this study, you can see our focus is only the self-reported data based on one database. Maybe for the future, we can have more enriched data and also bring more different audience the voice into the analysis. For future research, we definitely recommend conducting more empirical study to collecting multiple modalities of data describing teachers' barriers in using OER. We also suggest analyzing the causality, if any, between teachers' barrier and their relevant teaching behaviors. For example, like what kind of barriers will have the causal relationship to their behavior, like adapting OER or continuing to integrate OER. So only if we can have this kind of like a more granular understanding of the causal relationships between those variables, we can better support, as scholars, as educators, we can better support K-12 teachers to devise strategies to provide more tailored support for teachers to use the OER in the K-12 settings. And then by that time, we probably can, really support the personalized instruction in the K-12 settings for all the K-12 students. So yeah, the last slide is about our conclusion. Again, this is just like an initial effort for us to investigate the person-centered perspective of the OER barriers for K-12 teachers. But we just want to call for more effort, more research to see like how K-12 teachers use the OER and what kind of support they need from us as scholars, as educators, to support the K-12 teachers in their use of OER. And also we found out the 3 classes. We hope those profiles can provide implications for the future support the professional development strategy as well. And we found out the gap between the teachers' increasing need for the OER and also the low intention of creating and sharing OER. We hope like we can for sure have more pertinent professional development, and also we may just try open educational practices for teachers to get on board on the using and creating OER. So that's it. And before we finish, we just want to thank the OER Hub for their collecting the data and also graciously sharing data as open educational resources. We also want to thank Open Education Group for their support, and also the William Flora Hewlett Foundation for their financial support. And in the end, we want to thank Disney Education Journal for publishing our work, and also ODLAA for inviting us to make this webinar. And the last slide, we published this one, as an open education researcher, we published this article with open access. So here's the link and also the QR code. You can scan it, and later we will put the link into the chat box so you can download it without any cost. In the end, thank you so much for your time.
Many thanks, Hung Tao.
Thank you. So Sarah, do you want me to put this one as kind of like a slide for our conversation?
Just for a moment. That's it.
Okay.
That'll do. You could stop sharing now, I think.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Probably be good for everybody to see everybody's faces. Thanks very much for that. I liked a number of things there, particularly I love your frame of the 3 classes, the savvy, the resource, the struggling and the resource constraint groups. I think that's a nice filter framework to overlay on the many different experiences that people report about trying to implement OERs. Some had a brain dump. Over in the chat, you'll see lots of questions from some. Perhaps a lot of them are about the practice, about the actual doing. Shall I just allow you to have a read of those, Hung Tao, and you might want to make some comment there.
Sure, yeah. Oh, wow. Thank you so much for all of the insightful questions here, Sam, and I really appreciate it. Let me just open all of them here and see. So the first question, teachers belief systems about openness is critical. What can be done about this? So what do you mean by belief system? You kind of like a value belief about the openness?
Maybe it might be best to just sort of first of all, thank you, Hang Tao, for this presentation, Yubao, for the work. One of the things that I was attracted to, and we've been engaging with this paper for a very long time, is its focus on the person and personal belief systems of people, as opposed to the cost factor. Oftentimes when people have talked about OER, David Wiley and his group have always pushed this idea that OER are cheaper, and then in one of your slides, you put out the point that it does not do any harm, which is in academic jargon is not evidence. You know that, right? I mean, the fact that it does not do harm is no evidence for or in favor of a particular treatment or independent variable. So I'm glad that you shied away from the cost factor, because that's what the political imperative is. The political imperative of OER was always that, oh no, it's cheaper, that the publishers are robbing people off, they're making a lot of money. But I think the issues, as you say in your paper, you both say in your paper, are much deeper and related to personal factors, which is the way I've seen it. And this community of people, the people around this table, will be very familiar with your last slide about open educational practices, because the picture is much bigger, much larger than just OER. And where does OER fit in? So unless you answer the question, why bother? Then you are taking a very sort of reactionary step, looking at barriers. Looking at barriers in itself is not very useful unless you figure out why should people want to engage with OER. And in your slide, which is what I liked about the last slide on open educational practices, you say, look, there is a much larger benefit in the adoption of open educational practices, which is what this organization is all about. Open Distance Learning Association of Australia is about promoting open educational practices, and OER is just one little component of it. So unless teachers get to understand why they need to engage in OER and how best to optimize its use in learning and teaching, then looking at barriers are not very useful, because there could be all sorts of barriers, isn't it? The teachers need to be able to understand, and this is the challenge, that people need to understand. This is why 10% of the people understand why in your sample, they should engage with it. So if someone like you and I really understand, listen, if I had a choice of taking this book as opposed to this book, and one is an OER and one is not the other, which one would you use? And if the quality of both of them are the same, I would rather use the OER because I can engage my students with that subject matter in different ways in the 5 R's that you talked about, as opposed to the copyrighted material, which I cannot do that. So unless you get that point into the persons of the teachers or the personality of the teacher, then you're tinkering at the edges, which is really my point. So I don't want you to answer each question, but react to what I'm saying overall.
Yeah, but I think, yeah, that's what I really agree with, like a cost part, you know, that it is, right? So it's a kind of open license, you can use it for free, but beyond the free cost, I mean, not only if we talk about the cost is just like one part, not only OER, but some kind of low cost or no cost profiles, or kind of like the materials, they can play the same role as OER, but what is another benefit, or like what is the inherent benefit can make OER so important for the future is like the openness. So I totally agree with you, like unless the teachers can be aware of like the openness, like you are not using some materials only for this course, right? So you can use the materials for your, you can share with your students, then your student can share this stuff with a broad community, like some open education practice, how invited the renewable assignment, right? So you ask your student to do some, you know, they go back to the OER, they search for some the copyright free resources, and then they can come back to work on their own project. At the end, it's kind of like all of the materials are kind of like, you know, out of the restriction of the copyright. So they can share broadly, they can reshare it for their own purpose. They can, you know, those stuff can even benefit students who take the course later, or who kind of like not in the institution, but kind of like just interested in this topic online, right? So this gives a lot of possibilities for the open up the conversation, open up the scholarship, open up all kinds of like, you know, the knowledge sharing practices. I think I agree with you, like openness is the most important part regarding the benefits of the OER. And for teachers, I think, yeah, I mean, sadly, I would say like sadly, based on my observation, the teachers may first see the cost as kind of like an inherent benefits of the OER. And I agree with you, like we need to better address the openness part, about their beliefs about the openness part. Not only kind of like a open license, but beyond open license, the open educational practices following the 5R principles is the thing like why you want to use OER. You can return for sure, you can reuse, but what is more powerful, like you can revise, you can remix the stuff together and turn it into your stuff for your own class, and then to satisfy the individualized needs in that classroom. I think that is the most powerful part. And if you kind of like put the effort, you know, not just kind of randomly selecting the materials, you put the effort, you put the time to select the high quality stuff, and then integrate all of them together. If you can share it with a broad community, you can see like, you know, everybody can benefit from the, I mean, at least for the teachers, you know, themselves, this is kind of like a high quality resources for them to use, right? So I totally agree. I mean, that's you know, what we should do. And I'm so happy to learn about like the organization's, you know, objective to kind of like promote the open education practices, right? So to be open, and then to, you know, support educators to help them to be open about the sharing about the knowledge practices. So I totally agree with you, and I'm in favor of this kind of like open practices.
Tao, you used the word agency at one point. And I've been thinking, particularly when you were talking about one of the most empowering ways for teachers to realize or embrace the ideas behind open educational practices, with us focusing on the resources, would be to give them the space or the opportunity, or educate them in being able to create their own, or to do the modifications and share those things. But maybe I just find that very difficult to see some. It's scary to put your stuff out there. And we're already living in a world where everything is critiqued, especially in the education world. You know, what's the quality of this? Does it have worthwhile review? How many people have given it a tick? So I'm just sort of a whole pile of things going on in my head, thinking about the challenges around that. I don't know.
You mean the challenge about the kind of like a teacher agency in selecting or, you know, verifying the resources that you use for the classroom. Is that,
yes,
is that
and,
kind of
and I've created this now, and here I'm sharing it with you. I'm making it public for others to use, and you put yourself out there to be critiqued. And
yeah.
Hard enough
Definitely.
at the university level, never mind about a teacher in a primary school doing that, but maybe. Anyway, if you have any comment about that.
No, I think that's very important. So for the agency, like I think it's a huge word, right? So it's kind of like covered a broad range of the stuff for the teachers. Like when they select the resources, you know, do you have kind of like a criteria? Do you have like the competence to select the efficient OER? That's kind of like where you can fulfill your agency in selecting. And also for the creating part, like, you know, what is the quality in your instruction, right? So, I mean, not only just like fitting your own classroom, you need to think about it like you are trying to create those stuff and share with the broader community, at least within your school district or your state, right? So there's kind of like a standard, there's kind of like criteria regarding the kind of like hard line, right? For you to meet, for you to address the criteria of the quality. So as a teacher, for you to fulfill the agency is to think about the quality, control the quality. And other than that, not only teachers fulfill their agency, we, you know, as the teacher, you know, educator or, you know, professional organizations, we need to support them like to, you know, first to be aware of their agency and also to fulfill their agencies, to provide kind of like a support. For example, for OER, the content itself, maybe, you know, we as educators or scholars, we can do more kind of like the verification to reinforce the sustainability of the OER system, OER content. Like they can deposit with kind of like the you know, the criteria checking, the format checking. Then we can ensure that, you know, we can have a better quality assurance program. We can have a better sustainable system for the OER, for them to be used in the K-12 settings. And also another part about the using OER in K-12 settings is about the information security, right? So I did several research before, like in the interview, the teachers were concerned, like, you know, the links were just updated, out of date, or it's not secured. I don't want my students to see some, you know, the virus or, you know, the, what do they call it, like unhealthy website, right? Just because I want to save some money, I want to use the OER. So that's another part, like as a you know, educators, as scholars, as a teacher educators, and also professional organization, we can do all together to better support the quality assurance system, the sustainability of the OER, the cycle, right? So I think, you know, that's a, yeah, I'm not sure whether I answered your question accurately, but I think, you know, for teachers to fulfill their agency, it's not only teachers' responsibility. It's kind of like the responsibility for all of the stakeholders who kind of like contribute, who use, who develop the OER.
Not simplistic, is it?
One of the things that that interests me, and maybe I might be able to attract Yubao to make a comment on this one, is the point about causality. You did, and I know both of you have got very strong quantitative backgrounds, and this is something that that you struggle and you know, you work with all the time in educational research. You know, David Wiley goes up there and says, you know, the use of open educational resources produces equivalent or equal or similar sorts of achievement outcome. You know that that is such flimsy evidence anyway. So if you agree with what we were just saying a while ago, that the adoption of open educational practices is the bigger goal, that education is the public good, that what we are trying to do as a group here is to promote the idea of openness and sharing, the sorts of things that you're talking about, and the adoption of open educational resources is one of those things. How do you know that it's working? How do you know that it's working in positive ways? And this is why I'm directing this question to you, about not only to get her to speak a little bit, but give her an opportunity to say something about. And I know her background is assessment and quantitative methods. How do you? Because at the end of the day, people would want to say, why bother? Is it working? How is it working? For whom was it working? In what kinds of contexts is it working?
Oh man, that's a huge question. I didn't kind of expect this kind of huge question like this, but I really appreciate it. That's a very good conversation, I believe. For me personally, when I want to start with my feeling when trying to see why do we need a kind of causality in the education research when we try to figure out from our findings what kind of the inferences we can make based on the data, right? For the educational practices, the use of OER. I think first we need more empirical studies for us to inform the next step regarding OER adoption. And you mentioned we cannot just compare the cost, free or not free or save money. That's just one part, or it's kind of if we see the period that may be OER 1.0. But for now, we need to move beyond the cost considerations. We need to come into the second part, research, empirical research about the benefits of openness, right? And also how we can using existing evidence to inform our practice to support the benefits of openness in OER. That's what I want to, the message I want to deliver from, we need a more empirical study. We need to see the causalities between the constructs and the practice and also the strategies. So that's kind of that part. For the bigger concept regarding what is effective, how we evaluate the effectiveness, I think that's kind of multi-dimensional questions, or kind of involving multiple voices. It's just an educational problem. So if we think it's just as a very normal educational question, what is effective education, right? It cannot be only the students say, okay, I like school because I come here, I have friends. So that's kind of their likes, but this is not this doesn't mean this is effective education. So it's kind of students have Cs and the teachers have Cs, and also the other educational stakeholders have Cs about the open education resources. So I want to talk about the research perspective, for the field research, we're not only caring about teachers, we also need to look into the students' voices, not only just kind of the self-reported surveys or the data we kind of collected from backend or from the institution, but also kind of listen to their own voices, what they say about the OER, right? So if they feel I did it, as you mentioned a while ago regarding the openness part, if they kind of they see the benefit of openness rather than just save a lot of the money from purchasing the textbooks. So I think that's kind of one step or one signal regarding the effectiveness of the OER. What do the students really say about OER, or what teachers really say about OER? That's something we need to tap into for the future research or practices regarding the effectiveness of the OER. That's just my 2 cents. Maybe you have something to share as well.
Thank you very much, Hong Tao. We have to draw this to a close, I'm afraid. It's
well, I was trying to get you about to say something, but he never gave her a chance. So
thank you both of you for leading us through that very interesting and complex set of ideas. The more you unpick the ideas around open educational practices, you just realize how complex it is. It is very, very complex. But thank you very much. We've recorded it. And so I will just put into the chat now where you can find the recording once it gets up there. ODLAA has a YouTube channel, so it should be in the next couple of days. Please tell your friends that it's there. We also have a brand new website that was launched early this month, so some of you may want to look at that, and it gives you an overview of all the webinars that have been arranged for the coming months. Thank you once again to our presenters, and of course to everybody else who joined us today, and we'll close it there. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Mama. Take care.